From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden sends 1,500 troops to the U.S.-Mexico border as the Title 42 expulsion policy gets set to expire. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. On May 11th, the Title 42 pandemic-era policy of summary expulsions at the border under public health rules is set to expire. Let's start with a clip from White House briefing this week. Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre responding to Fox News reporter Peter Doocy's question on why those troops are needed.
If the border is secure, as the administration has said, then why would we need to send 1,500 active duty U.S. troops down there?
Because we need more work. More work needs to be done, Peter. We put forth a comprehensive immigration legislation, and Congress, Republicans in Congress refuse to act. And so the president has used the tools that he has in front of him to prepare ahead of Title 42 lifting. As you know, that is happening.
Mene, can you remind us what the Title 42 policy actually means? And what do you expect, or what do analysts expect once that is lifted is going to happen at the border?
Sure. So Title 42 is a policy that was invoked by the Trump administration in March 2020 during the very beginning of the pandemic. And so it uses a public health authority, it's actually the CDC's authority, to say that any migrant during a time of a public health emergency can be turned away at the border without the opportunity to claim asylum. And that's very important because generally the Immigration and Nationality Act would guarantee the right of any foreign migrant to present themselves to a Department of Homeland Security officer if they cross the southern border and have their asylum claim heard, which then means that they would be entered into a long process and theoretically allowed to stay in the country until their actual hearing. But Title 42 allows DHS to turn away these migrants summarily without processing them or giving them a chance to potentially be released into the country. And so it was implemented by President Trump and used to turn away more than 2 million migrants during the time that it's been in place. The Biden administration very early on expressed its intention to end the policy because it is their official position that migrants should get the chance to have their asylum claims heard. But because the number of border crossings was so high over the course of the past few years, they found it too useful to get rid of, even though they profess to want to do away with it. And so it's only now slated to come to an end on May 11th, because that's the end of the federal public health emergency. But because migrants know it's going to be much easier to get into the country once Title 42 is lifted, many of them have been massing on the Mexico side of the border, waiting for that expulsion coming next week. And the Biden administration is now scrambling to try to put together a suite of replacement policies that will allow them to control the surge that's coming to the border.
I understand the utility of Title 42, but in my mind, the ending of it is long overdue. I mean, we've been in this limbo land for a while now, where for some purposes, the White House is saying that the pandemic is over. You don't need a mask on airplanes anymore, just to pick one example. And for other purposes, the pandemic continues. It continues at the border. It continues with relation to student loans. And so it seems to me, Kim, that President Biden should have been working long ago to end this policy and put in place something that can handle the flows and deal with the border crisis in lieu of it. And just to provide some numbers on this, at the southern border, the number of encounters with U.S. Customs and Border Protection in March alone, 1 month, was 192,000. That was down about 15% from last year, but obviously 192,000 is still a lot of encounters with people at the border, and nearly half of those in March ended with Title 42 expulsion. So 88,000 Title 42 expulsions in March alone. And that looks like a pretty big number, Kim, against this 1,500 troops that Biden is now sending.
Absolutely. And, for the record, I think most people agree with that position, Kyle, that the pandemic is long over. And this authority, from a legal perspective, really shouldn't continue to exist because we are no longer in a pandemic. The problem is that obviously, the White House has dismantled some of the only other tools it had to deal with this. In particular, when it first came in, it got rid of the Remain in Mexico program, which was a program that said, okay, if you make it to the US border and you claim asylum or try to enter under an asylum claim, that's great. But significant numbers of you are going to have to remain in Mexico until your claim can be heard. And this kind of had a couple of different merits in that one, you didn't have that many people coming across the border, but two, it was a dissuasion to people. It sort of made people stop and think, okay, do I really have a claim that's likely to get heard in the end? Because I'm not necessarily going to be automatically sent into the United States. I'm going to have to stay in another country for goodness knows how long until my claim is heard. And the fact that Title 42 is going away and the fact that it's taken so long, it's been in part because of pressure from some in Congress who said, look, okay, yeah, we get it and appreciate that the pandemic's over, but we've got nothing else. And so it was intriguing today. You saw a group of bipartisan senators come out, Kirsten Sinema, Joe Manchin, John Cornyn from Texas, Tom Tillis, another Republican. And what they are now proposing is legislation, bipartisan legislation, that would essentially set up a different version of Title 42. It would give the administration a 2-year temporary expulsion authority that just would exist because there is a crisis at the moment at the border. That would be the rationale behind it. And the idea would be to give Congress some breathing room to then address maybe some of the bigger issues that are going on here, including the fact that we have an asylum system that clearly is not adequate to the numbers that are hitting the border. There are a lot of ideas in Congress about how you do that, how you toughen it up, how you change the process so that people maybe only be able to claim it not at the border, but in other places. But that's going to take some time for people to work out. I have no idea if this legislative proposal to replace Title 42 has a chance of passing, but it says a little bit about the worry that's going on in Congress about what's going to come next week.
Monet, what's your view on what kind of policy changes might actually make a difference in the border? And set aside for the moment that we have a deadlocked Congress, making those policy changes difficult to enact, although if President Biden wanted to, he certainly has a bully pulpit and could maybe get 10 Democrats and a bunch of Republicans in the Senate together to get something through the filibuster.
Right. I do think that the ultimate policy source of the problem is the widespread knowledge in the Southern Hemisphere that the U.S. is very lenient in the way that it applies its asylum law. As I mentioned, that asylum law originates in the Immigration Nationality Act that's originally in 1952 and has been extended and refined several times by Congress. But that creates the right to claim asylum, and it does specify the requirements that potential claimants must meet to be granted entry into this country. And the text of that law states that the claimant should be under a material threat and have a credible fear that they might face violence to be admitted into this country under the asylum law. But over time, particularly Democratic administrations have been extremely lenient in the way they apply that law. So theoretically, it's supposed to be administered by asylum immigration judges in the Department of Justice. More and more, we're seeing those determinations of whether these claimants have a credible fear of violence being made by Department of Homeland Security asylum officers. And there are very, very high rates of these claimants being found to have a credible fear and admitted. And so as long as that's the case, as long as the application of this statute makes it so easy for people to enter the country, generally people are going to have a very strong incentive to keep coming. And it almost seems as if there are very few policies that could be administered at the border that would be able to deter people from arriving. And so that should be the main goal in the long term. But in the short term, it probably would be much more helpful to have additional detention space. So the Department of Homeland Security does detain a certain number of migrants who arrive at the southern border are granted conditional permit to remain in this country before their claims are heard, but it just doesn't have nearly enough detention space to keep even a small fraction of the migrants who cross. And so most of them under the current administration are released into the country to wait, and many of them end up skipping their trial dates and essentially assimilating into the country undetected. The Department of Homeland Security should be requesting significantly more space than they have to be able to detain both single individuals and migrant families in much greater numbers than they currently do. And so the short-term patch, again, is increasing the detention space. And the long-term fix really is changing the way the Immigration and Nationality Act is applied to make it more difficult to be granted a claim of asylum in this country.
Kim, on the politics of this, is there a shot for a bill with some of these reforms that Monet outlines? And I'm wondering if you think that the political context has changed at all as the border crisis has started to hit cities even 1,000 miles from the border. And I'm thinking specifically of Chicago. On Monday, Mayor Lori Lightfoot wrote to Texas Governor Greg Abbott about the buses full of migrants that he has been sending to cities throughout the United States. She said that Chicago has heard that Texas is planning to resume that program on May 1st. And she says, I'll read a couple portions. Since we began responding to the arrival of migrants sent by your delegation in August of 2022, we've shouldered the responsibility of caring for more than 8,000 men, women, and children with no resources of their own. She adds, we simply have no more shelters, spaces, or resources to accommodate an increase of individuals at this level with little coordination or care that does not pose a risk to them or others. And keep that number in mind, 8,000, because the city of El Paso this week declared an emergency, anticipating the end of this Title 42 policy. And there are some estimates in the El Paso Times that right across the border there are about 10,000 to 12,000 migrants who are waiting to cross into El Paso, which is not the size of city that Chicago is, where Lori Lightfoot says they are struggling to care for 8,000 migrants who have showed up their way. And Kim, do you have a sense that the fact that the migrant crisis is now coming to some of these blue cities will free up any political room in the Democratic Party or for President Biden to try to contemplate some of these changes to these policies?
Yes, so as you were reading those numbers, Kyle, I was playing the world's smallest violin. I mean, it's really remarkable that you see these governors now complaining in light of what's been going on at the border for years. Although I will say this, congratulations to Texas Governor Greg Abbott, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, because when they started doing these busing, the entire point was to make sure that everybody saw what was happening down there and sort of share the burden, as it were, and bring some attention to this in some of these sanctuary cities that want to maintain policies like sanctuary city, but don't want to do anything about the consequences of it that are happening at the border. I mean, here's the problem with this, though. Even though you've got Lori Lightfoot complaining and New York complaining, the letters were directed essentially to Texas. This needs to be instead getting directed at the White House. And yes, you have had some Democratic governors complaining, but not about the policies, complaining that they want more resources. Okay. And, even that Lori Lightfoot letter, it wasn't complaining about the policies, it was complaining about how they're overburdened and they need more help. And this is one reason why the White House hasn't acted. It's really quite remarkable because it's such bad politics. The vast majority of Americans are united in a belief that there's a serious problem at the border, and Biden gets very low marks from that, again, across the board, across the political spectrum. He won't move because progressives want there essentially to be an open border. And so this is why the White House says there's no problem, even as it sends 1,500 members of the military down there, because it knows that the potential for these kind of horrible video to start coming out next week is very, very high. I think they would get remarkable support if the White House were to come across and get behind a bipartisan proposal like the one that Sinema and Manchin and Cornyn and Tillis put out and said, okay, we've got to do something immediately about a porous border and about these surges. And then he might be able to repair some of the damage he's done over the last couple of years and maybe push the Congress toward a bigger fix. Because the problem is that this administration's refusal to do anything about this, to even suggest that there isn't a problem, has infuriated Republicans and really poisoned the well for the kind of bipartisan work that needs to be done, the kind of deal in which you end up having not just good border security, but also address the questions of legal immigration as well, too. That's what Democrats always say they want. The problem is they have created such a mess at the border. Nothing is going to change and no Republican is going to move until some steps are first taken to deal with border security.